Hello everyone, this is Bob and Threadbare, and welcome back to Weaving Worlds. Today's deep dive into fictional peoples will be taking a look at a traditionally villainous fantasy race, the Orcs. And while the modern concept of orcs originates once again with J.R.R. Tolkien, he did not invent the word or the concept. What is an orc? The word orc, much like the words elf and dwarf, has its roots in the Proto-Germanic language. There were a few different pronunciations and spellings originally, but it most likely has the same roots as the word ogre and means the same thing: a humanoid monster that isn't as big as a giant and isn't as magical or whimsical as an elf. Another possible influence is the word orcus, which comes from Latin. Orcus was a Roman god of the underworld, and while the word orc is most likely a coincidence, it does seem to have influenced the modern mythology of orcs, which includes the idea of them living underground in vast caverns or caves. And of course, the other big influence on modern orcs is the Middle-earth setting of J.R.R. Tolkien. In Middle-earth, orcs were created as corrupt beings, although Tolkien has presented several possibilities as to how they were created. Depending on the source, orcs are either corrupted elves, slime given humanoid form, the offspring of elves and beasts, or corrupted humans. Regardless, the point is that orcs are corrupt, irredeemable, ugly, prefer darkness to light, and can be easily controlled by more powerful, evil creatures. The Ugly People. Regardless of the source, orcs are almost universally depicted as ugly in some way, at least by human standards. Their skin tends to be gray, yellow, or green, which are colors generally associated with sickness. They often have bad teeth or tusks, although the tusks come from Dungeons & Dragons, since orcs in D&D, at least back in 1st edition, had the heads of pigs. For similar reasons, orcs also often have pig snouts and ears. As for other common traits, orcs are generally depicted as being bigger and stronger than humans, as well as less intelligent and more savage. However, this combination is problematic, to say the least, since it's also how Europeans would describe Africans back in the early to mid-20th century. And more generally speaking, it's similar to how city dwellers would describe nomadic raiders or even less advanced sedentary tribes. In other words, this portrayal has deep roots in xenophobic thinking, and so even if orcs don't necessarily represent any given human ethnicity, portraying them as savage outsiders still normalizes xenophobia in all of its racist, religious, and nationalist variations. So try and keep that in mind when you're deciding how to use orcs in your setting. Orcs as the evil army. This is the oldest use of orcs, at least after they were codified by Tolkien into something more than just an obscure word for monster. As I mentioned, the idea was to make them irredeemably evil, so that there would be no moral debate as to whether killing them all is good or bad. In addition, the only orcs we meet during the Lord of the Rings saga are active combatants, and so aside from morality, there is also a military reason to kill every orc. For that matter, the Uruk-hai, the elite orcs created by Saruman, aren't born but created as adults, ready to fight and kill. There are no Uruk-hai women and no Uruk-hai children. So if you want to use orcs as an evil army with no shades of gray, I'd suggest you do the same thing. Orcs are not like humans. They don't have sex or create children, lovingly or otherwise. They have no non-combatants, because every orc either fights wars or directly assists the war effort, and takes up arms when given the opportunity. Warhammer 40k is a good example of this. Space orcs reproduce through spores. Young orcs are essentially goblins that mature orcs use as cannon fodder, and the chaos god of debauchery has little to no effect on orcs. In other words, if you want orcs to be inhuman monsters, then be sure to make them so inhuman that you can't possibly mistake them for humans. Orcs as the barbarian horde. To take orcs a step closer to realism, you can have them exist as a barbarian horde, as a group of nomads or settled tribes who frequently raid their neighbors and otherwise menace the built-up towns and cities that surround them. In other words, your orcs are exactly the thing that their xenophobic stereotype is based on. This gives you a chance to use orcs in their original context, and it also gives you a chance to give orcs more depth and culture. Perhaps to the city-dwelling humans and elves, orcs appear to be bloodthirsty and destructive, but once you follow them home, you'll find orcish farmers and hunters, smiths and homemakers. The orcs have a unique culture and religion, and a rich artistic tradition expressed through clothing, decorations, dancing, and storytelling. They don't live in ramshackle huts under torn and blood-stained banners. They live in yurts or teepees or sod houses. And while they perform less civilized forms of violence like raiding and ransacking towns, they don't perform more civilized forms of violence like public executions and pogroms. Orcs as the foreign overlords. This is the next logical step to making orcs a legitimate culture that lives on the edges of civilization. Much like many other such cultures, the orcs of your world may end up invading and conquering vast regions and becoming a new ruling class. Perhaps your orcs are Germanic in nature and will both invade and settle less populated regions. And while they become the new rulers, they also assimilate into the local culture. Or maybe your orcs are more like the Mongols, and they perform massive invasions that unite vast regions, but they eventually fall to infighting and are overthrown by their subjects. Or perhaps your orcs are Manchurian, and while they are culturally similar to the empire they conquer, they maintain themselves as a separate and superior ethnic minority, with strict rules against cultural mixing. Or else, your orcs are Arabic, and together with their new subjects, they forge a new religious and cultural identity that spans entire continents. What's really intriguing about this approach is how it follows naturally from the orcish stereotype and yet defies it completely. Instead of being too savage to create, too primitive to assimilate, or too backwards to innovate, the orcs of your world are great conquerors who create empires that last for hundreds of years and, if only for a moment, lead the world in innovation and cultural development. Your orcs may look ugly, but that doesn't have to stop them from building something incredible. Orcs as the oppressed underclass. What if, instead of signifying xenophobia, your orcs signify classism? After all, a person who is ugly, crude, violent, and ignorant is also a stereotype of the lower classes. And it's not that far off from what Tolkien envisioned, since he believed that there are orcs in every nation's population. Also, it's not a coincidence that the Lord of the Rings movies give orcs a lower class accent. So, rather than being the conquering champions, orcs in your world are among the many subject peoples within a large kingdom or empire, or else the occupants of a slum in a relatively modern setting. This pairs well with using elves as the upper class, since it matches well with both groups' stereotypes, while still painting the orcs in a more sympathetic light, at least for most modern storytellers. Orcs as the underestimated. What if orcs look like orcs, and everyone around them expects them to act like orcs, but the way they actually behave is completely different? What if orcs are actually intelligent, civilized, more advanced than everyone else, and all of this is completely hidden from outsiders? The orcish stereotype is what a sedentary culture sees when a raiding culture attacks them. It is never the way any culture, raiding or otherwise, sees itself. And you can point this out by maximizing the disconnect between perception and reality. Maybe orcish society casts out its most violent and aggressive members, and those are the only ones that outsiders interact with. Maybe humans have seen orcs but never interacted with them, and so the stereotype is based solely on appearances. Or maybe orcs used to be crude and violent, but then contact with them was lost for some reason, and during the decades or centuries of isolation, their society became advanced and sophisticated, outpacing that of the humans. It can be fun to set up expectations only to shatter them, and orcs can give you a very effective opportunity to do so. So whether you just give them a little extra depth, or you turn the whole concept of them on its head, try to do more with orcs than Tolkien did. Thanks for joining me again for today's journey into weaving worlds. Please like, share, and subscribe because that raises my visibility here on YouTube. Check out my other stuff if you have some time, support me on Patreon if you have some money, and I hope I'll see you again for the next video.